Okay, this is Carol Merritt at the Atlanta History Center on Tuesday, October 25th for Voices Across the Color Line. I'm talking this morning with Connie Curry. Welcome to this interview. Glad that you had a chance to come. What I really would like to do at first, if you could just tell me something about your background.
Okay.
And then we can get into some of the other things that you've been involved with.
Okay, my parents, Ernest and Hazel Curry, were actually born in Belfast, excuse me, Northern Ireland, and they came over to this country and they settled in New Jersey first, and my sister, Eileen Curry, and I were born in Patterson, but we moved down here pretty soon after that to North Carolina, and that's where I actually consider as having been raised. And because I started in the 3rd grade in public school there. And so I didn't have what would be called the typical white Southern woman upbringing. My mother in particular was very independent and read a lot, and she, I think, paid Social Security for Miss Thompson, Sadie Thompson, who used to come and help us with the ironing and, other things. And I remember mothers that she didn't have a whole lot of friends, but the women who did know, the white women who had, quote, maids, couldn't understand what in the world she was doing paying into a Social Security, because that just wasn't done. So I was lucky in that being a child of the 40s and 50s, right up to the 60s, in a totally segregated society. I was not born or not raised with all the usual prejudices of Southern whites, and in fact knew early on, and I thought a lot about this, of the why, but knowing early on that there was a big gap between the reality of what I saw around me and what I was learning in school, which was about the Constitution, what I was learning in church about God loving everybody, and then in my daily life, even as a kid, to see the disparities in between the word and the promise. I mean, the word and the actuality.
What impact did an Irish background have on your upbringing, your culture, your attitudes, and did you at any time ever experience any anti-Irish feeling?
No, we didn't. I tell you that what we mostly experienced in terms of the last question was anti-Yankee, because we had come down from New Jersey, and let's see, so when we had moved there in the, I guess in the early 40s, and people from the North were considered, Yankees, and anything we did that was strange, they said, well, they're Yankees, And I remember my sister coming home once and saying that, they're talking about politics and Yankees and everything, she said somebody at school had told her that her mother had said that she didn't care if Jesus Christ was running for president if he wasn't a Democrat. Of course, that was back before the great strangeness of the mix-up between Democrats and Republicans. And I've also thought about what impact the Irish background, because even though we were from Northern Ireland, which was Protestant, which was not considered part of the rebellion, and but I think that my father, I think I heard him say that he had left Ireland because of the oppression, which, and I've thought about it and talked about it, and you sort of get it into your soul that oppression is oppression is oppression is oppression. And I must have known early on that the British Empire had tried to control and to treat the Irish in much the same way, as lower class, as less than human, not as I remember, the pigs in the parlor imagery and the this is particularly true of Southern Ireland, but an awful lot of prejudice, and I think my mother and father didn't really believe that, and I think it was the manifestation of the beginning of the battle that made them leave in 1925. I think they knew it was going to be a long, hard battle. Now, how much of that seeped through, articulated, I don't know, but it certainly became clear as later on, because when I was in college in the 50s, I remember reading William Butler Yeats, Patrick Pearse, a lot of the Irish or the Irish radicals, and they would say things like, beware when ye masters, when the people rise up, and always equated that, to slavery and beware of the white masters. So there was a lot of transfer there, I think.
So in coming up in Greensboro, did you have any relationship at all with any blacks other than the woman, say, who worked in your household?
Well, not really. Now, I remember, and here again, I don't even know what precipitated it, but I remember in the 4th grade when we were in the lunch counter, standing in front of the aisle, when you go down to get in the cafeteria, and Douglas Gilley, who was standing next to me, called one of the servers behind the counter, a nigger, and, I turned around to him and said, that woman is just as good as your mother. Well, you don't talk about mothers in the South, you don't say anything. It may be true everywhere, but anyway, that day I had on a new raincoat, and I remember he pushed me down at play period into a mud puddle, and it spattered my yellow raincoat, and I never will forget that. But now, what makes a 4th grader pipe up, that woman is just as good as your mother, except that, like I say, my parents were very good about letting us have our own thoughts and being, independent. But in answer to your question, no, I didn't really have any contact until I came to Agnes Scott here in '51 as a freshman. And my freshman year, I had the opportunity to go to a national congress sponsored by the United States National Student Association, and student governments belonged to it. And it was very interesting because there were a lot of southern universities, and Emory belonged, Georgia Tech belonged, Morehouse, Spelman, Clark, and all over the South, belonged to the National Student Association. And delegations that you would send representatives up to this national congress, which was always held in the in the center of the United States, so that it could draw from all over the country. Mm-hmm. And I volunteered to go my freshman year. So at 18, I went to Ames, Iowa, which was my first National Student Congress. And they debated all kinds of questions, and it was really, really interesting. And of course, then during the night, well, my roommate, after my freshman year, was a black woman from Xavier in New Orleans, so I had
At Agnes Scott?
No, at the National Student Congress. Yeah, we didn't have black students at Agnes Scott for a long time, as you know. But, my roommate at the national meeting in Ames was, so, and then I remember coming back, and I went to Atlanta, to Agnes Scott, and my sophomore year, and I would talk about my experience, And then I started going to meetings because I had met some of the delegates, and I would go to, or get a cab and go to Spelman or go to Morehouse or go to wherever the meeting was. The interesting thing was I had to get permission from my mother and father, written permission, every time I wanted to attend an interracial meeting. Now, part of that was trying to protect Agnes Scott because, integration, eating together, and even was, quote, against the law. It was segregation was by law, So but my mother said, can I just write you blanket permission? Do I have to write one every time you plan on going to a meeting? But that's the way it was. So I did that bit by bit, and then after my sophomore year, when I went to another national congress, I was elected chair of what by that time was called the Great Southern Region, and I mean it was great. It stretched from Texas to Georgia, all the way across the South. And as the starting about the time of the Supreme Court decision, Southern and also during the early 50s, NSA, which was started by somewhat radical students who had come back from the war back in the late 40s, they were very advanced. They were for academic freedom, broader academic freedom. They were for against discrimination, particularly in higher education. And so Southern colleges, the white ones, began to think this is really a sort of a communist front student group, and they began to drop out. And then after the 54 Supreme Court decision, when the National Student Congress voted to support and, in favor of that, all the white schools started dropping out. Now, Agnes Scott always stayed in there, and when I was chair of the region in 54, I never will forget, by that time, Baba Tunde Olatunji, I don't know if you knew Baba, he was the famous drummer from Nigeria. He was student body president at Morehouse the year I was student body president at Agnes Scott. And we got to be really good friends. And I remember I planned a meeting at the YMCA down on, oh gosh, I've forgotten where it was. It wasn't the black YMCA, I think it was the white one that was back then on Forsyth Street. And we could meet there, but we couldn't eat together. And I remember at lunchtime, when we came out, all the black students headed down toward Auburn Avenue, and the rest of the delegation, went someplace else. And I think it was then that I began to realize that it was not only a religious and intellectual and historical stirrings but that the law affected my life personally, because I couldn't eat with my friends. And once you start taking things personally, the passion is enhanced.
Just to back up a minute, you had chosen Agnes Scott. Was there a reason for your choice? And was there something special about Agnes Scott that they happened to be the only white school remaining in that
No,
continuing
I
to
didn't
send
choose Agnes Scott. My parents didn't have a whole lot of money, and in all frankness, I was going to go to the Women's College in Greensboro, but I applied and got a scholarship to Agnes Scott. It was Presbyterian, basically, and I heard about it at the Presbyterian church when my family went in Greensboro, and a friend of mine was going, and so I applied and got a fellowship. But I came down here sight unseen. I knew nothing about Agnes Scott. And why they stayed, I don't know. It stayed in NSA. I tried to figure that out by trying to talk to some of the leaders back then, but of course that would have been before. I mean, a lot of them were before. Well, I know why we stayed when I was there, but I'm just curious about. I mean, we stayed because I thought it was great. I'd come back and tell everybody what was happening, and they, a lot of people couldn't fault me very much because I was, the Agnes Scott dream. I was Phi Beta Kappa. I was student body president. Had a Fulbright. I was mortarboard, so it wasn't like I was some sort of maverick, So I was a leader, and I would just say, we're going to do, this is the way things are. But I think that Agnes Scott has always had a tradition of good professors and I wouldn't say exactly liberal, but certainly more of an atmosphere of free thought. Well, then Emory, of course, and then which was started like Coca-Cola and a whole lot of more conservative business interests, and then of course Georgia State. I mean, Georgia Tech was a state school, so all the state schools were dropping out across the South because they got state money, and the communist thing was getting in the 50s, you know, it was getting very big, and anything that was different, you labeled communist, you know. So I've thought about that, about why did Agnes Scott stay in so long, and never have quite put my finger on it. I think it was a combination, yeah.
So NSA was kind of like a bridge for you
Yeah.
to a broader world where you
Mhm.
could kind of continue
Yeah.
your
Mhm.
development in your thinking.
Exactly, on race and on, you know, they used to debate. I'd go to the congresses and they'd be debating why why China should not be thrown out of the United Nations, and they would debate all these issues, you know, that for me from Agnes Scott College were just so interesting, and all these guys and women who were so smart would get up and debate things, and it was putting me in touch with a whole other world. Certainly different from getting on the bus to go to Emory fraternity parties.
And your major in Agnes Scott
History.
was history.
Mhm.
Okay, but at some point you also went to Columbia.
Yeah, yeah.
In political science, was it?
Yeah, I was only there for 6 months, but I went on to Columbia too.
Okay,
I
with
went on to France on a Fulbright, then I came the next year and went to Columbia. But then my mother died and I went home.
I see.
Yeah, but I went in political science. But history, I remember saying when I went to Columbia, when I started studying, I thought, gosh, this is dry compared to history. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so then you started to work for NSA.
Right. In 1960, NSA had been holding these, it was called Southern Student Human Relations Seminars with money from the Field Foundation. And the concept in 58 and 59, I believe there were 2 of them, was that there were Southern students in colleges, kind of scattered, white and black Southern students that were unhappy with the segregated world they lived in, and that if there was only a chance for them to talk to each other and try to bridge the gap on all kinds of issues, like at the NSA congresses, you know, you wouldn't have to debate about race. You could debate about the United Nations or about curriculum and academic freedom and all these other things. And the concept was that if there was some way to kind of enforce or allow the mechanism for black and white students to get together, that either directly or indirectly you would have a building of toward racial, well, see, it wasn't in terms of equality in the sense of like the movement became, but it was of understanding, I guess, because
It's
if you
contact.
yeah, exactly, because if you couldn't sit in the same room together, you couldn't eat together. It was, you know, we're totally separated. So that seminar went on for 2 years, and about 36 students attended, 18 each year. And Field Foundation was really impressed with the stories of what leadership those students took when they went back. So in 1960, they gave NSA a larger grant to set up a full-time office in Atlanta called the Southern Student Human Relations Project. And I was living in New York and working for this collegiate United Nations thing. And they called me and said, you know, we want you to go back south and open up our Human Relations office in Atlanta. And when did I go back? January of 1960.
Just in time.
Just in time, I know. People said, how'd you get involved in the movement? I said, I was in the right place at the right time. I said, no big thing that I did. So that's what happened.
Okay, so you were then still working for the Field Foundation when you, say, attended the meeting in Raleigh?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
I worked for NSA, the Southern Human Relations Project, from 60 to 64, even though after the Raleigh meeting in the beginning of SNCC, I was, quote, an adult advisor along with Ella Baker. You know.
Right. And when did you first meet Ella Baker?
I don't remember the exact day, but I was living here in like I say, in January of '60, and then the sit-ins were in my hometown. In fact, I was in Greensboro visiting my sister, and I remember hearing on the radio 4 Negro students from A&T College are sitting on lunch counters at Woolworths, and it was noon radio. And I thought, boy, is that interesting, never knowing, that by June of that year there'd be 70,000 students involved in demonstrations, but I never will forget. So when I came back and started talking to people in Atlanta, somehow Julian and Bond and Lonnie King, and I got in touch with all of the Atlanta student movement people, and they asked me to try to find some white students that could become part of the Atlanta student movement. And then somewhere along the way, Ella was up in New York. I think she was still working for SCLC, but she found Jane Stembridge, who was going to Union Theological Seminary, and she asked Jane to come down to help launch SNCC. Now, I think this was after Raleigh, but I don't know, somewhere before Raleigh I had met Ella, and I'm not just in meetings or passing, because she was, as you know, fascinated by the students movement and wanted to keep it separate from an SCLC or an adult-run initiative. So she was very, very close to a lot of the SNCC people.
So at the Raleigh conference, had some white students come with you to that conference?
No.
You had gone there by yourself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I hadn't really been able to recruit any. That was Easter weekend. I hadn't really been able to recruit many white students at that point.
And I know it's a long time ago, but do you have any detailed memories of anything from the, I mean, aside, I know there's the overall
yeah, well, I remember
push of it,
yeah,
but what do you remember?
I remember specifically Ella's speech, because her whole talk was more than a hamburger, and you probably read that, but I remember her saying, and she was such an eloquent and powerful speaker, but I remember that, and the impact hitting me, that was when we really began to realize that the sit-ins were more than just, the movement was beginning to be much more than a demand for something to eat, at a lunch counter. And then, of course, I remember being so overwhelmed at the breadth of the representation there, because I never will forget, I used to get tickled because there was a guy named Virginius Thornton, and he was from one of the schools in Virginia that I had never heard of, a black, but he said, "My name is Virginius Thornton," and I can just hear him now. And Bernard Lee was there, and it was Diane. All the people from Nashville were there. I remember being very impressed by the Nashville people, because of course they'd been doing nonviolent training workshops with Jim Lawson for a long time. So I was very impressed with the Nashville contingency, because they were very different in many ways from the Atlanta movement people and some of the other people, like from Alabama or South Carolina or something. But
you mean better prepared, better trained, better focused? Yeah,
they were better. They were more articulate about what one needed to do in demonstrations because of their training in nonviolence. They were also, they had been, they were aware of the political implications about how you had to try to get to the white community and negotiate, and a lot of things like that. And So, but I don't remember a lot of the details. It's just sort of like a kaleidoscope, you know, of just being really moved and knew something big was about to happen.
Was there any discussion, though, at Raleigh, or maybe soon after in some of the other follow-up meetings? Do you recall the discussions about whether the headquarters of SNCC would be in Nashville or Atlanta?
Yeah, there was some talk about that, and I think there was, I don't remember the details. Keep on thinking I ought to go look it up in the minutes, but which are down at the King Center. But I know that some people wanted Atlanta, some people wanted Nashville, and Atlanta won. You know, I'm not sure what the dynamic was there.
Okay.
It may have been because Dr. King and Ella were here.
Well, what was it like being an adult advisor to SNCC, a white woman in the movement?
Well, it was funny because, first of all, I mean, you know, Ella was 30 years older than all of us. I was, what, 4 years older? So it wasn't a big, I thought it was funny. And, you know, Julian used to kid me and call me the, what was it? The sugar mommy of the movement, because I had a salary and I had an office. And he said, that's the whole reason we put you on the advisory committee, you know, because we could use your mimeograph machine and your mail machine, because they had no money whatsoever. And so they used to kid me about that. But I never felt, and I've thought about this a lot, because particularly in the new wave of feminism, and just a lot of the historians have probed and probed and probed to try to see if somewhere in my psyche there are not memories of being white and that being strange, and I have no recall. And I have a really good memory, and I just don't remember anybody ever making, now I'm talking about the early days of the movement. I'm talking about 60, I left in 64, and went to work for the American Friends Service Committee. So those first years of SNCC are always what Casey Hayden and some of the other white women in the movement make that differentiation of 60 to the summer of 64, which was really the beloved community. And I remember thinking a couple times, because of the SNCC meetings, it attracted all kinds of people. I mean, that certainly was not in my frame of reference. You know, rapid-speaking, Marxist, long-haired, sandal-wearing, quote, strange-looking people to me from the north, and everybody was, and Hurlith Jensen and Jim Monsonis from national religious organizations, you know, white guys who were really, really helpful and believed in the movement, and like I say, very left Marxist types, and everybody was, you know, was welcome. It's really an example of the beloved community, and I just never felt anything about being white. Now, I remember, I think I put it in my chapter in the book, I remember a couple of guys, black guys, you know, and I think the sex thing, people always bring it up because, as you know, with the history of white women and black men being a no-no, and the mythology historically around black women being, you know, sexy and all of this stuff. So there was always that dynamic of wanting to try the forbidden among everybody. But it's like, you know, Casey said, when people talk about, when everybody went to Mississippi and everybody talks about who was sleeping with whom and about sex in the movement, she said, you know, look, we were all 19 and 20. We all had raging hormones. You're on the front lines every day. Half the guys didn't know if they were coming back. You know, we didn't know if they were coming back, and said, yeah, there was sex, you know. So, but it may have been that my being, quote, an advisor and the fact that I was never employed by SNCC and therefore was never on the front lines in the sense of being a field secretary or representative, so I was never quite in as vulnerable a position, so to speak, to have the gender or the sex thing enter in. So I remember a couple guys, approached me and asked me, and I said no, and I'm still friends with those that did, so, it was not a big deal to me.
You had said that Field Foundation money really helped to support SNCC. How so?
Well, because I was paid, I used some of the money to get to help get publish the Student Voice, which Julian was the editor of. I would get permission to use some of the money to travel to meetings and help other people get there. We got money from another foundation to run a voter education project in Raleigh during the years that I was with NSA and SNCC to register voters up in that area, using black students as the people to do the door-to-door. And so I just channeled as much of the movement, keeping the 4 human relations seminars each summer, 60, 61, 62, 63, keeping them intact with the concept of bringing black and white students together. But a lot of those students, now that there was an opportunity for students, black and white, to participate in social change, which had never been a big thing in this country, Chuck McDew, who was the first chairman of SNCC, went to one of these NSA seminars. Casey Hayden did. Joan Browning, who later became involved in the Freedom Rides. Bob Zellner, who was the first white male field secretary. So it was became more and more of a training ground for movement people, and that helped, So, and the good thing about it was that my advisory committee, the only thing they ever told me that I could not do, they were very supportive of this big switch from the original concept of the Field Foundation, Southern Student Human Relations Project, which was to put black and white students together so they could talk about things, and all of a sudden it's emerged into a support for a civil rights movement or a freedom movement. And my advisory committee, who was composed of all these star-studded cast, from Ruby Hurley at the NAACP, Ralph McGill, Will Campbell from Nashville, C.H. Parrish, who was a black professor from Louisville, Father Clancy and Father Victor from New Orleans, and Harold Fleming of the Southern Regional Council. The only thing they told me was that I couldn't demonstrate and go to jail, and that was fine with me, actually. But that was the other thing. Nobody ever made me, used to be the saying, you have got to give your body, you've got to put your body on the line. And nobody ever gave me a bad time. I was a designated observer. And I went to all the demonstrations, not all, but I went from Augusta, Nashville, all over the place. And it was a good role because I called the newspaper, I called Donald Hollowell, to get bail, to get legal stuff. So it was good to have somebody that you trusted on the outside. And that was my role.
Do you recall any of the demonstrations? Any particular recollections?
Oh, yeah.
What about some in Atlanta? Do you recall any of the demonstrations in Atlanta?
In fact, it's really interesting because I'm going through old papers and stuff in my house, and I came across this paper, which is Creative Loafing. From November 1981.
You want to hold that up so we can get a picture of that?
And it's called Taking Racial Measurements. And what this is November 26, 1960, by John Dougherty, and he was a policeman. John Dougherty was a policeman in Atlanta on November 26, 1960. That's 45 years ago during this Thanksgiving season.
Mm-hmm.
It says 10 a.m. November 26th. This date we muster. This is unusual. We normally start at 3 p.m. I notice everyday shopping crowd, the humdrum of traffic moving, but shoppers both black and white, evidently aware of the day that lay ahead, but still not giving way to their thoughts, scurry home to shelter. Now that was when it was the sit-in at Rich's was scheduled, and at the Magnolia room. And so this is an account of the and here's,
This is a white policeman.
yeah.
Okay.
And here's the Newsweek story. Truce over, December 5th, 1960. In Atlanta, it was the end of an extended month-long truce between sitting-in student groups and local merchants that had the city on edge. On the morning after Thanksgiving, about 150 students, mostly Negro, but with sprinkling of white youths and girls, moved in on the lunch counter of drugstores, dime stores, and department stores. Their center of operations was Rich's, one of the South's great department stores. As fast as the sit-ins began, eating facilities were closed and the students turned to picketing outside. On street corners, hard-eyed men watched. The police department was out in full force and empty paddy wagons circled the business district. There was no violence. On the second day, Klansmen in robes staged their own march around Rich's. The sit-in pickets back again eyed them warily. Again, there was no violence, but the tension in the air was wire-taut. Now, I remember going down and observing that Thanksgiving, sit-in, and I remember when I'm not sure it was the same day, but when there was a sit-in at the Magnolia room in Rich's, this is a very, very funny recall. One of the Klan people in Georgia back then was named Calvin Craig, and the Magnolia room was like over here, and there was you paid and came through or went through and ate, and then you came back out, and the elevators were over here. And Lonnie King and Julian and all of the people, I can't remember if Dr. King was in that Rich's sit-in the Magnolia room or not. But anyway, they all went in, and I was standing at the elevator right over here, and Calvin Craig, the head of the Klan, was standing right by me, and he was muttering under his breath, goddamn dirty nigger, so-and-so, and so-and-so, and so. And then when they came out, because they were going to be arrested, when the students and all of them came out, I was saying, dear Lord, please don't let Julian and Lonnie and everybody reach up and say, hey, Connie, how are you? And they must have known who he was because they kept their eyes. Nobody showed any recognition of me whatsoever. And, there was always that kind of respect and sensitivity to that I felt personally. But yes, I went to that demonstration and I saw, it was scary to see the Klan marching on one side of Forsyth Street down at Rich's, well, it used to be Rich's, and seeing the students on the other, because it was just so tense. And then I went to the demonstration down at the state capitol, because when they marched down to the state capitol, and I remember that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was there, and they had all these cameras, and they were taking pictures, of every single person that was marching. And of course, I was watching everything, and I had this very funny guy, Mike Sayre from New York, with me, and he said, the way you beat the GBI and all that dumb photography is you start taking photographs of them taking photographs. And so Mike was skirting through the crowd and taking photographs of all the GBI people. And so it's little things like that that you remember. But before we get too far from 1960, I came across this letter, and I was so thrilled to find it. It just happened last week because I never would have known where to get it. But this is when I came down in...
Can you hold that up?
Yeah. When I came down
yeah.
in 19... moved all my stuff down in February of 60.
Uh-huh.
My assistant at the project was my roommate from Agnes Scott, Donna McGinty,
Uh-huh.
and we lived over in Virginia Highlands on Adair Avenue,
Okay.
which is right off of Highland. And we had an apartment, and then when Jane Stembridge came down, she moved in with us. And then there was a woman named Bonnie Kilstein from New York who came down for the summer. And so the four of us were living there. And I was up at the NSA Congress, as a matter of fact, running the seminar, you know, the Student Human Relations Seminar, which was always the 3 weeks prior to the Congress. And I got back, and we had been moved out of the apartment lock, stock, and barrel. And they were all living over on Moreland Avenue, and here's the letter. Dear Miss Curry, Miss McGinty, Miss Stembridge, and Kilstein, occupants of 1008 Adair Avenue, you are hereby given notice, as verbally given last evening, to vacate your apartment immediately. Drinking, noise, and association with colored men on a social basis are not allowed in this building or on these grounds. Do not have Negroes here. Have the apartment vacant by Thursday evening, 6 p.m., August 11th. So,
Wow.
Isn't that something? And I'm so glad I kept this
Yes.
letter of eviction. So much for Virginia Highlands, right?
Okay.
But anyway,
So you all moved to Moreland?
yeah, they moved all my stuff, and when I came home, everything had been moved out. But that was also the period I had a red and white Carmen Ghia, which was the joy of my life. It was my first car, and it was a little red and white, sporty-looking car, and I just loved it. And I came home from the National Student Congress, and the Klan had painted KKK in big blue letters on my beloved car, and that I was really mad about, But anyway, that I wanted to give you a tenor of what Atlanta was like. Yeah.
Okay, so back in the 60s, so did you attend any of the meetings of the Atlanta University Center Student Movement Committee on Appeal for Human Rights?
Almost all of them, yeah.
Okay. Were you at the one at Warren Memorial when there was real dissension about delaying the movement, and some of the people were very, very upset with Martin Luther King Jr.'s father, but then Martin Luther King coming back and giving a speech that tended to unite people behind what the agreement was?
I can't remember if I was at that, and I've read the account of it so much, that sometimes you can't, I don't specifically remember being at that one meeting.
Okay. Back off a little here. Okay. What do you recall of Jane Stembridge and her role? I'm trying my best to get to interview her, but it may take a little bit longer here.
And a lot
But
of
I know,
persuasion.
I know, but
Yeah. You're trying.
I'm trying.
And I'll try to help you. She's very reticent about that. She says she doesn't know anything, and it's not true, but anyway, I don't know. Well, I just remember her, of course she was living, with me, so we got to be really good friends and are to this day. But she was really a dedicated soul, with it all based in her theology and based in the fact of her Christianity. Her father was a minister and in Virginia, and I gathered had some problems with some of his feelings, more liberal feelings about race. But Jane was absolutely true blue to everything, and she was was very well versed in a lot of things. In fact, I remember that the reason that she left SNCC was she and Ella and I actually organized the conference, the SNCC conference, you know, which came up that fall. I think it was in October. Because, see, everybody else was students. I mean, there were no paid staff. And I often think about people who accuse SNCC of being male-dominated. It was these three women who put that conference together. But anyway, Joan wanted to have Byron Rustin. Jane Stembridge wanted Byron Rustin to speak. And I remember it was a big controversy because he was controversial back then. And Jane said that she was going to resign if the executive committee would not let Byron Rustin speak. And to the best of my knowledge, he did not speak. But that's the conference where Lillian Smith spoke. And there's her speech. Lillian Smith's speech is brilliant. In fact, I have that someplace. And when I give my papers for the big exhibition, I'm going to have a lot of stuff.
So you haven't given everything to Emory?
No.
Okay.
No, a lot of stuff I haven't given.
Wonderful. We would certainly be interested in borrowing
Yeah.
some of those materials. The letter you just read was wonderful.
Yeah. You want to turn that off for me? If it's not.
That would be great. We're on now. In fact, maybe we can. You're going to take it back and
Yeah.
make a copy. Okay, that'd be great, as well as the letter.
Okay.
Okay. I'm still back on those early days when SNCC had an office down on Auburn Avenue, and you were talking about that little office and some of the eating at B.B. Beeman's. What are some of your recollections of those the earliest days when the earliest people involved doing the office work were women?
Yeah. Well, we had, I remember Ella and Jane and I would meet in that little teeny office on Auburn Avenue and try to, plan things and see how we could help each other out and everything. And I remember I used to take Ella home a lot in my, she loved riding in the front seat of the Carmen Gia. And then we would go.
Where did she live?
At the Wallahachi, which was an apartment building that was out past Atlanta University.
Westlake,
Yeah. And we would go out there, and I would have a scotch, and Ella would have bourbon, and sometimes she would make lamb chops, which we both liked. I don't remember Jane coming with us. That was actually after Jane had gone. I think that when Ella was working for the YWCA in the same building that the NSA conference, NSA office was in. But I just remember meeting. I would either be going out to Atlanta University to meet with the Atlanta groups, or I remember going to B.B. Beeman's and meeting in that back room. And we would meet until late, and way past midnight. And I recall Bob Moses and I would go and get a hot fudge sundae, and that was our gift to ourselves and our way of surviving some of the meeting, because everybody pondered everything. So it was really funny. I've forgotten. I think somebody raised the question of what should we do about the fact that somebody down in Albany, who was a movement person, had been accused of taking a radio from the house that where he was staying. And Lord have mercy, you would have thought it was the crime of the century. We talked about everything, and then somebody somewhere, a male staff person was accused of, or allegedly had gotten a local young woman pregnant, and should he pay all, if she was going to Mexico to get an abortion, which she wanted to do, how much should we pay and who should pay what for what? And whether it was, and in retrospect, I really, and even probably during the time, I was very respectful because people were so non-judgmental. You know what I mean? They pondered everything about what our responsibility was to the community, and there were the philosophers, versus the more active types, and it was just fascinating because it was the same people who were for nonviolence as a method, as opposed to those who believed in nonviolence as a way of life. And I myself could understand it as a method, but never as a just never got to me about what it meant as a way of life, because when I observed the violence when I was up watching the Nashville sit-ins and saw people putting cigarettes out on people's backs, as they were sitting at the lunch counters, I thought, ain't no way that I'm going to let somebody put a cigarette out on my back and think about how much I love him, So there was always that dynamic going on between, on one level or another, about, and the great thing about Ella was that she would just let people say their feelings, and then somehow to try to get people back together again toward what we were about. And I remember that really clearly during those years.
Yeah.
But I was going to meetings with SNCC on Auburn, and then also keeping up with the Atlanta student movement people.
Right. Did they ever come together, really, COAR and SNCC? I haven't had a chance to talk to Lonnie King yet, but...
Well, you better talk to Lonnie about that because, Julian quickly became involved because he came over as the, what's called communications director. I don't ever remember, there was not animosity or anything as I recall, but you need to ask Lonnie or something.
Yeah, and then there was Ruby Doris, too, who came out, but for some reason I didn't get the idea that they didn't exactly join together. They still remained pretty separate organizations.
And I remember SNCC people participating, well, there was nobody there here yet as staff people. And then, of course, I remember Bob Moses coming down in '60.
What do you recall of that?
Well, it's funny, Julian and I were talking, and I remember us talking about how we thought he might be a fellow traveler because he was so smart. We thought everybody who was different back then. A lot of Southerners, black and white, when we didn't know something, we thought that there might be something communist about them, That was what you called everybody that you didn't understand. Well, I guess the whole country was sort of trending toward that way. It was, right after the McCarthy thing and everything. So, but anyway, we were all intrigued by Bob because he was so smart and he was so wise, and he wanted to go to Mississippi. And I was surprised in his book when I see that it was Jane Stembridge and Elle and I, that Bob's book, Radical Equations, that it was the three of us that, and I think it was my Carmen Gibb, we took him to the bus station, and he says in the book that the three of us were watching where he sat on the bus. So he said he sat down sort of toward the front till we left, and then he went and got in the back. I think that's what the book says, but anyway, Bob was wonderful. Jane and Bob were really close. They wrote and wrote and wrote. I wish Jane would talk about that. In fact,
It'd be nice to hear a dialogue between the two of them.
Oh boy! In fact, when I found out Jane was coming, I called Bob and said, "Is there any way you can get up here on what was it, September the 11th or whatever that date was? Because Jane's coming." And oh, they adored each other. Yeah. And she's got all kinds of letters and stuff to him.
Well, we're just going to have to work on it.
Yeah, but they were quite close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other people that you'd like to share memories about? You've mentioned Julian. What about John Lewis? Did you work with him at all?
Yeah, I knew all the Nashville people pretty well. And Diane Nash was the first think she was I don't know whether, well, I can't, yeah, Diane, I believe, was the first woman on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You know, we would have executive committee meetings, and then we would have a full meeting. But then, of course, I got to know Ruby Doris, and I remember one of my main memories of Ruby Doris was I went up to Rock Hill, South Carolina, for that demonstration. This was our first attempt at, oh, that was another thing we discussed in these meetings, jail, no bail, jail versus bail. And this was the first time we were going to have no bail when people got arrested in Rock Hill. And that was, again, one of the most violent things I remember was the Klan and everybody getting arrested in Rock Hill. And I have a vivid memory of Ruby Doris. We were staying at a minister's house, and we were all ready to go down, and I was to observe, and Ella was there, and I can't remember what other SNCC people were there, but it's in the records down at the King Center. But Ruby Doris had her hair up in rollers, and she made us all sit. She said, "I'm not going anywhere until my hair's done, because I'm going to be in jail tonight." So we all sat in the living room and waited till Ruby Doris's hair was done. And isn't it funny how you remember small things like that?
Yeah.
But that was her. That was so her. You know,
Uh-huh.
she was tough. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Did you know Ruby Doris?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
She, at the time, she was in the Atlanta office.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Memories of Casey.
Well, Casey.
Casey Hayden.
Mm-hmm. My first memory of Casey is she is one of the people that I met through the NSA project. The University of Texas, remember when I mentioned that there had been 2 human relations seminars prior to the establishment of the Human Relations Project as a full-time venture. Ray Farabee from the University of Texas was the first Southern president of NSA, and it was through him and his leadership that Field said, "Okay, we believe you that there are students in 1958 who want to do things differently in the South, and we will give you this money for the seminar." So the University of Texas was very instrumental, and Ray did an awful lot for NSA, and he's still in at the university, still down in Austin. But there was a woman named Rosalie Oakes who was the head of the YWCA in Austin, University of Texas, and she, I believe, contacted me and said, "Why don't you come down here and meet some of our students who I think would be really good for the Southern Student Human Relations Seminar." I went to Austin in the spring of 1960, and I met Casey, and I remember sitting in a coffee shop, and I was telling her about the brutality of some of the sit-ins and about everything that had happened, and I remember we both cried over, as we discussed the horror of what was happening. And then we remained close friends. I'm probably the closest to her of all of the white women in the movement. Casey and Sue Thrasher probably I'm the closest to. But Casey's had a really pretty hectic life in many ways, and she finally, is in Arizona and doing really well, but she's had her ups and downs. But we're very, very close still.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And she's a wonderful writer. She's much more of a philosopher and than I am. You read her
Yes.
chapter?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you can tell that she. And she had been through it. I mean, she was on the front lines and very affected by the rejection of whites, because she wasn't interested in organizing whites. And she's really a good friend.
Yeah. The final moment. Can you comment on that book, Deep in Our Hearts, and what kind of a statement it makes?
Yeah, what happened was in 1994, Bob Moses, we had the people in Jackson, Mississippi organized the 30th, would that have been the 30th anniversary, 64 to 94, the 30th anniversary of Freedom Summer. And all of us went down there for that, and Casey was there, and a lot of other people from SNCC, and it was great. And Bob Moses, we were in one meeting, and Bob said, we have all got to start telling our own stories, because historians don't always get it right, and people are getting older, and I want everybody to start, we all need to start writing. Okay. After Bob's admonition about everybody telling their own story, it was basically Casey who knew all 8 of us there, and there was some attempt to try to see if we couldn't get black and white women involved. The way it panned out was that there were the 9 of us who were able to come together and who were able to contain it to 50 pages and put together the book. And it's been very well received, because a lot of people don't realize that what the movement truly was, and I think the book helps articulate that in many ways.
Okay. Well, listen, I'd like to thank you so much for coming and sharing your story.
Yeah, well,
It's
you're
been
certainly
important.
welcome. Yeah, well, I'm more than happy to talk about it. I really like to. And if other stuff comes up and you need me to come back, you've got a lot of time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you.
Yeah, if you need me to come back or ask questions, and we'll get the material and go through my boxes. It's sort of interesting that I'm going through my boxes right now at a time when, there's going to be a place to put it. So,
Exhibit it.
yeah,
Yes.
good.